Okay, Tov, Chodesh Tov. Today's daf is daf Lamed. And we're up to V'yaisei Shtei Saras Meikara. So we're finishing up a sugya in order to get to the Mishnah, sugya that we started yesterday. And the Gemara now is raising a question, an objection to Rebbe, who holds that according to Rabbi Hanina, when a person makes a declaration, Im katan ani, v'im gadol ani, he refers to katan mamish and gadol mamish, meaning that he has shtei saros. And this is the way that he convinced Rabbi Gamliel that Rabbi Gamliel doesn't have to bother with a bedika and be matriach himself a bedika. So the Gemara now is going to raise the following issue. According to Rebbe, that when Rabbi Hanina spoke about im katan ani ayeh b'shvil abba v'im gadol ani ayeh b'shvil atzmi, he had in mind katnus and gadlus mamish of shtei saros. So now the Gemara is going to say that this is not going to help Rabbi Hanina to solve the problem of karbonos at the end of his Yimei Nazirus. Why? I'isi shtei saros meikara. If they check him out and after they investigate, they find that Rabbi Hanina had shtei saros before his father was madir him b'nazirus, that's not a problem. That's not difficult for Rebbe because koyim b'nazirus delay. Now his own personal kabbalas nazirus on himself will be valid. His father's kabbalas nazirus on him will not be valid. He's already a gadol. And he has shtei saros at the time that the father wants to be makabel nazirus on behalf of his son. His son Rabbi Hanina is already a gadol, so that kabbalas nazirus is not valid. But Rabbi Hanina is now accepting nazirus upon himself as a gadol, and he'll bring his karbonos at the end of his nazirus. Ulubasov, and so too, if let's say he brings shtei saros after he finishes the 30 days of Nazirus that his father was madir him, that's also not difficult according to Rebbe, because Kaim bin Nazirus diavua. Now for these past 30 days, he was implementing the Nazirus that his father was makabel on his behalf, and therefore bring his karbanos at the end of that Nazirus. But now here there's a girsa problem. Instead of the probably should say Ella, I see b'mitzia, but if, let's say, in the middle of his 30 days of Nazirus, meaning the Nazirus that his father had imposed upon him, he brings shtei saros in the middle of this Nazirus, now we have a real difficulty. Because how is he going to bring his karbonos at the end of his Nazirus? Because the Gemara is of the opinion that according to Rebbe, according to Rebbe, who holds that the cutoff point for the father's ability to be makabel nazirus and to impose it on his son is gadlus, is shtei saros. And once he has shtei saros, then any nazirus that was chal until that point that he has shtei saros, by virtue of his father's kabbalas nazirus on him, is batla. It's completely null and void. And that's called Nazirus Shel Av al Benomis Batelis Me'lea. It immediately, automatically becomes Betela when the son becomes a gadol, i.e. when he brings Shtei Saros. So why did Rabbi Hanina tell Rabbi Gamliel that he doesn't have to check him out? Because Benkach hu Benkach Mimonavshach, he made a Tanai in such a way that his Nazirus would be valid. We do have to check him out because we have to know that if he'll bring Shtei Saros in the middle of his Nazirus, then I'm talking about the Nazirus that his father accepted upon him, then he will not be able to bring karbonos at the end of that Nazirus. He'll have to start a new Nazirus if he wants to accept upon himself Nazirus from the moment that he has Shtei Saros, count 30 days and bring his karbanos at the end of those 30 days, but not at the end of the first round of 30 days. Now, the Gemara wants to point out that this question is not a question according to Rabbi Yosef. only according to Rebbe, was stuck against a brick wall. We don't know how Rabbi Hanina has obviated, circumvented the problem and the need for Rabbi Gamliel to make a bedika. And as we explained, there's a definite pressing need to make that bedika. Why isn't this a problem according to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda? And the Gemara is going to now make a premise that according to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, where the cutoff point for the father's Nazirus on behalf of his son is at the age of 12 if he passes the investigation, meaning that he knows, meaning mufla samach liish, that according to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, if in the middle of his father's Nazirus of 30 days, his father was makabel on his behalf, he would now reach the level of mufla samach liish, his Nazirus would not be betela. And therefore, Hanichol Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, the Oman Sheagia Onas Hanidarim. Now, when Rabbi Hanina says to Rabbi Gamliel, Im Kotanani, Vim Golani, he meant to say a different kind of katnus and gadlus, not the katnus of gadlus of universal katnus and gadlus, namely saros, but rather the specific katnus and gadlus with regard to nidarim. Now it's not a problem. He can bring his karbanos at the end of that Nazirus, meaning the Nazirus that his father was makabel on him. And why is that? Because even if in the middle of those days of Nazirus, that 30-day period, he will breach the mufla samach leish, the level of onus nedarim, his Nazirus would not be betela. And the reason for this is because mufla samach leish, says Tosfos in the Rosh, is only the Rabbanon. And the Rabbanon never made a takana that mufla samach she'ish should generate a bittul of Nazirus. So whereas havas saros, that's a doraisa halacha, and that will be mevatel the Nazirus. But mufla samach leish, which is a Rabbanan halacha, will not undermine and terminate the Nazirus. So therefore, if he gets checked out, and we find out that, well, again, let's emphasize the following point. Rabbi Hanina is telling Rabbi Gamliel, you don't even have to bother checking me out. Why? Because if I'm already a mufla samach leish, and I will pass all your tests with flying colors, and I know what nidarim are all about, then I am now a Nazir by virtue of my own personal Kabbalah. And if, on the other hand, you would investigate me and you would determine that I'm not a mufla samach leish, I haven't reached yet the onus nidarim, then my father's Nazirus that he imposed upon me would be valid. And even if I become a mufla samach leish midway through the 30 days of that Nazirus, it would not be mevatel the Nazirus, and therefore I will bring my korbanos at the end of those 30 days. El Rebbe diyomat sheyovish te saros. Michael and Meimar, according to Rebbe, that we're dealing with godless doraisa of Shtei Saros, that certainly will be mevatel the Nazirus that he began based on his father's acceptance of Nazirus, because Shtei Saros godless is doraisa, and that's going to be mevatel that Nazirus. And now we really have to know at what point he has Shtei Saros, because if he has Shtei Saros in the middle of the 30-day period, that's going to be mevatel his Nazirus. And he's going to have to delay his karbanos until 30 days of the Nazirus as a gadol after his saros. Amri, and the Gemara says that we came to the conclusion that Rebbe, according to Rebbe Shita, that we're talking about gadlus mamish of Shtei Saros leka takanta adi Yosef delay v'Yosef davui. There's no way out. He's going to have to fulfill and complete 30 days of Nazirus based on the father's Kabbalah's Nazirus, and another 30 days based on his own Kabbalah's Nazirus, and then Mimanavshach, he fulfilled his Nazirus of 30 days, and then he can bring his Karbanos. Either he fulfilled his Nazirus because the Nazirus that his father was Madir, and that's assuming that he didn't have Shtei Saros until after the 30-day period passed, or alternatively, in the worst case scenario, if he had Shtei Saros within the middle of that 30-day period, and that's mevatel his Nazirus, he now is makabel his own Nazirus, and at the end of that 30 days, he will bring his karbanos. So the maskana here of this Gemara is that even according to Rebbe, we can justify what Rabbi Hanina said to Rabbi Gamliel, that you don't have to bother with Bedika, but we have to realize that it's much more complex according to Rebbe, and the karbonos of the Nazir, B'siyam Naziruso, will have to be delayed until 30 days after he saw Shtei Saros, an event that he saw Shtei Saros during the middle of this 30-day period of Ha'av Shehider Espino. And this leads us to the Mishnah here on Daf Lamed. A man was makabel the Zirus after the death of his father. And we're going to see that there's halach l'moshe misinai that if the father was mafresh mos, we'll call him mos stumos, for the karbonos of a Nazir, and then he died. Now the son is makabel on himself Nazirus almanas on the condition that he could bring the karbonos of his siyum Nazirus with the mos that his father had designated for his father's Nazirus. Ha'ish megaleach l'Nazirus aviv. In such a case, where the son was makabel as Nazirus after the death of his father during his lifetime had designated mos for karbonos of a Nazir, those mos can now be appropriated by the son and designated for the karbonos of his, meaning the son's Nazirus. V'yena isha megalachas al Nazirus aviyah. But the halacha Moshe Sinai only applies vis-a-vis a son, not vis-a-vis a daughter. And therefore, a son can be megalech, meaning he can use the mos for the karbonos that will allow him to do tiglachs at the siyum of his Nazirus, but a daughter cannot. Ketzad, under what circumstances does this halacha Moshe Sinai apply? Mishayahu v'yav Nazirim. In this case, it won't apply. If there's an overlap during the lifetime of the father of both the father's Nazirus and the sons, the Ifishavich most of Stumin Naziruso, Umeis, is in such a case where the son's Nazirus overlapped with his father's Nazirus, then they're two separate independent Nazirios. And therefore, Umeis, when the father dies, on Rabbi Yossi, since he was already a Nazir during the lifetime of his father, those mos cannot be redirected towards the karbonos of the son. They're two different Nazirios. And they're both equally, individually obligated in karbonos of a Nazir, the father and the son. When the father dies, any mos that were designated, if they're stumin for the karbonos of a Nazir, will now have to be recalculated towards Nidam. So then, when does the halacha Moshe Sinai apply? Ezum Nazir shemegalech al Nazirus aviv harehu shaya aviv Nazir. He himself, the son, is not a Nazir. V'hayelo mos stumin, the father designated mos for his karbonos Nazirus umeis. And then, after the death of the father, Amar the Ben declares, Hareini Nazir al menashe galech al mos Abba. Zeu, that's the case of a Nazir, shemegalech al Nazirus aviv. Because then the second Nazirus, that of the son, after the death of his father, is a brand new Nazirus that's predicated on the mos for the karbonos of siyum Naziruso that were designated by the father. That's the halacha Moshe Sinai. The Gemara now clarifies this. My taima on Rabbi Yochanan halacha he ben Nazir halacha Moshe Sinai ben Nazir, that only a father could be only a son could be megalech on the mos of the Nazirus of his father, but not a daughter. Pshita, meaning if you already have halacha Moshe Sinai, then why are you making such a big deal about this as if you discovered America? This is the way the halacha Moshe Sinai was given, was handed down, and it was transmitted exclusively for a son to bring his karbonos for the Nazir from the mos of his father, but not a daughter. The ben yorishis avu v'bas lo, and the Gemara now brings a halachic basis for this conclusion that the daughter cannot use the most of her father after his death for her karbanos, even though she accepted Nazirus after the father's death. And why is that so pashut? The bas yoresh es aviv. Does a daughter inherit her father? And the answer is yes. A daughter does inherit her father under certain circumstances. This is the parasha b'nos tzlavcha. Lo tzricha de lesle elabas. There are no sons. There's only a daughter. Ma'al deteva yorshin gemirla. Since the bas is now yoreshes her father, she can now inherit those mos that were designated by her father for his karbanos. Kamash Malon. Now we see, and this is on the bottom, on the top of Daf Lamed Amud Beis, halacha. That there's halacha l'Moshe Sinai, that the laws of Yerusha and the rights of a daughter when she's has no brothers to inherit her father did not kick in as far as the most of Nazirus of Aviyah. And that's the chiddush here that our Mishnah is coming to emphasize.